everyone. It's great to see you again. As part of this module on Russian foreign policy, we've been looking at Russia-China relations last Friday, and then we had the deep dive into Russia and the Middle East yesterday with a couple of lectures. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Venkatesh Varma, who will speak about an Indian perspective on Russia and India's relations with the Russian Federation. Welcome. It's really great to have you. Ambassador Venkatesh Varma was a member of the Indian Foreign Service for a long time, from 1988 until 2021. I believe you retired last fall. He served as ambassador to the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, but also to Spain and to the Russian Federation. So he was ambassador to Russia from 2018 till 2021, so quite recently, but also just told me when we chatted that he served previous rounds at the Indian embassy in Moscow as well. The ambassador has a vast experience, particularly in India's security and defense policy, including the nuclear domain. He worked on multilateral non-proliferation and disarmament, so nuclear, chem, bio, and also conventional weapons. Did 3 postings to the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, and he was also several times a member of the Indian delegation to the UN General Assembly. So welcome to you. We look forward to your remarks and the subsequent discussion with the students.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for the kind introduction. And my thanks to Anna for roping me into this very good Monterey Summer Symposium. I've had the pleasure of listening in to some of the previous sessions. I'm very impressed. I learned a lot, and also want to thank Pan Liang for all the support that he gives us in making these seminars go on time. And thank you very much for that. So I've been asked to speak on, give an Indian perspective on Russia. You've had several perspectives in the last week or so, but the one big difference this time is that I'm not a scholar. All of you are far better qualified than I am. I barely scraped through a Master of Philosophy almost 40 years ago, and that's almost rusted and dated. But all of you are freshly minted out of great universities and with great research projects going. So that's one great difference. But I've had an opportunity to work in Russia 3 times. As a junior diplomat, I went to Russia when it was still the Soviet Union. So I was in Moscow when the Soviet Union broke up. I was then posted to Tashkent. So one of the consequences of the downsizing of the large Indian embassy in Moscow was that I spent 2 years in Tashkent and was there during the exciting times when Uzbekistan just became a newly independent country. Then the second time I went back to Moscow was in 2000 to 2003. President Putin had just become president. He's still the president. And the third time was 2018 to 2021 until October last year, when I, of course, finished with Moscow, and I retired from the Indian Foreign Service. Of course, between academics and scholars and diplomats, there are some differences, but essentially their craft has certain common elements. And these commonalities, I think, are essential in good measure when we study Russia. Russia is not unique in any specific way. Sometimes an effort is made to show that Russia is very, very unique and often in a very negative way. But I think Russia is like big countries, and big countries have certain common characteristics. It also is a country where geopolitics has a long history, and strong leaderships, and the waves of history are sometimes seen with particular relevance of how you study the present is always helped when you have a sense of where all this comes from. Dmitry Trenin, my good friend, who has already spoken to you a couple of times, he's very fond of saying that there's not one Russia, there are many Russias within Russia. So we need to be sensitive to the complexity of Russia. Russia is not just Moscow, it's not just the Kremlin. Russia is vast, it's great regional diversity. There are several generational layers in Russia. There is today the generation that has grown up in Russia, has seen no one else except President Putin in the Kremlin. But there is also the generation, their parents' generation, that has gone through the horrifying period of the 1990s, the weakness of Russia, the humiliation of Russia, but also the democratic excitement of Russia in the 1990s. But there is yet another older generation which is seen and is still traumatized by the experiences of the decade leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Dmitry Trenin is also fond of saying that Russia is capable of showing in 20 years revolutionary changes that are completely unrecognizable. But Russia is also capable of showing that in 200 years, nothing has changed. So Russia is a fascinating country, and I congratulate all of you to have chosen Russia as some part of your specialization. And obviously, going forward, it's... But I think between a scholar and a diplomat, I think keeping an open mind, a curious mind, an inquiring mind, being skeptical about generalizations, looking for granular reality, looking for opinion that may not entirely fit into stereotypes, looking for trends, calling upon history to explain the current, but not predict the future. These are several sort of methodological sort of tools that have held me in good stead. And I'm sure as I share with you, this is something that you would also realize and discover in your own quest to understand Russia. Let me turn briefly to India-Russia relations. India became independent about 75 years ago from British rule in 1947. The then Soviet Union established diplomatic relations in April of 1947. So we have about 75 years of diplomatic relations. For the first several years, Soviet Union's diplomatic relations were very low-key. Prime Minister Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, sent his sister, a lady, Pandit, Madam Pandit, to the Soviet Union as India's first ambassador. Stalin never met her. Stalin barely met the next ambassador, who was a philosopher of Oriental philosophy from the University of Oxford, Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. Why Prime Minister Nehru chose one of the foremost philosophers as an ambassador to the most materialistic country in the world in the late 1940s and the early 50s is a mystery even to me. Stalin met the third ambassador, and in the first meeting he asked him, you've gained independence, but are you really an independent country? Because India had joined the Commonwealth, and Stalin said, but are you like Canada? Notionally independent, but not really independent. That was the perception that Stalin had of India. Relations picked up in the mid-1950s during Khrushchev's time. They came to a very big tipping point during the 1962 conflict between India and China, where the Soviet Union initially began by saying that it would not choose sides between an ally, which was China, and a friend, which was India. But later on, the conflict slowly started to tilt towards India. The Soviets also gave India, in its early years of independence, a lot of support in building up our industry, our oil and technology sector, our pharmaceutical sector, our railway sector. There are a number of areas in which Soviet assistance for what was then a planned economy that India was trying to follow. Soviet assistance was important. Soviet military aid to India began in the early 60s, but reached a sort of very mature stage in the 1971 India-Pakistan War, which led to the creation of Bangladesh, where the Soviet Union, at the basis of a treaty, the 1971 Indo-Soviet Treaty, extended considerable support for India in the triangular relationship between India and the Soviet Union on one side, Pakistan, which was supported by the United States and indirectly supported by China. During the 1980s, I think India sort of had very good relations with the Soviet Union, but started diversifying its relationship by establishing pretty good relations with France and the beginnings of a good relationship with the United States, largely on account of the fact that the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan had led to a considerable negation of our security interests in our region. The Soviet Union broke up in 1991. In the 1990s, we went through a period of certain amount of dislocation in our relationship, but the relationship again picked up slowly and steadily. Picked up pace when President Putin took over the presidency in the Kremlin. In the year 2000, we signed what is called the Declaration of Strategic Partnership. And the relationship has gone forward in the last 20 years and remains in a very stable and solid fashion. The main pillars of the relationship are, of course, defense. Over 60 to 70% of our defense inventories are of either Soviet or Russian origin. But India has also started diversifying its military procurements from countries like Israel, France, and the United States. And with the United States, in the last 20 years, we have bought almost $20 billion worth of equipment. So how do we explain this large element of continuity in India-Russia relations, despite the tremendous global changes that have taken place? I would say that not having a common border helps, because big powers, when they don't have common borders, you tend to avoid some of the more common problems that arise between states. Secondly, there's been a certain level of strategic convergence based on geopolitical interests. I think Russia has seen in India an advantage to itself if India were to remain an independent country, an independent voice, both in Asia and in the international system. So unlike many developing countries which became allies of the United States, alliance partners of the United States, India remaining independent of any alliance relationship with any country, and I think has been seen as a positive factor for Russia. Russia has also seen India as an essential for the balance of power in Asia, and that goes back also to the 1960s in its own relations with China, and that has acquired a new meaning in recent years. But this is also a relationship that has been nurtured at the leadership level. Successive prime ministers in India and successive leaders in Russia have attached priority to the India-Russia relationship, though it has helped. But it's also been backed up by popular sentiment. I think there is a general feeling in India that Russia has stood by India in difficult times. Russia has never worked against Indian interests to India's detriment. That is the general perception. And including on the issue of Kashmir and Russia's membership of the Security Council has helped India take on certain diplomatic challenges. While these are also memories from the past, I mean, some historical memories tend to color public perception, and this is an area where the public perception is good. For Russia, it is interesting because during the Soviet period, Russia had no friends, basically. It had a number of alliance partners. Of course, alliance partners are never really friends. I mean, they are alliance partners first before they are anything else. But India was an independent country, was not an alliance partner of anyone, and still a friend, in a sense, did not work against its interests. And I think it saw a window to the developing world, to the non-aligned world, as it was then called. And India had acquired a certain weight in international relations because of that fact. Let me turn briefly to the current situation between Russia and Ukraine. There's been a lot of discussion on this, and obviously there would be an interest in what position India has taken. In my view, India has taken a rather balanced view of the conflict. Of course, Russia has crossed a very major red line in terms of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of an independent state, which is Ukraine. But we also have to take into account the historical background leading to the collapse of European security since 1991. Basically, I think there has been two big miscalculations, three big miscalculations, I would say. The first big miscalculation is being part of Russia, that the steady expansion of and the deterioration of its relations with Ukraine over the last 10 years, more than in the first 2 decades of Ukrainian independence, would not be exploited by external powers. And I think Russia depended on France and Germany to oversee the Minsk agreements. And the Minsk agreements drifted from 2015 onwards, and a lost opportunity was there, which was lost by Russia to settle the problem with Ukraine. Russia may also have miscalculated because the early few months after President Zelensky was elected, and President Zelensky was elected on a ticket for establishing peace with both Russia and Ukraine and Europe. Let's not forget that. It is in the later part of his presidency that President Zelensky turned dramatically against Russia. On part of the United States and NATO, I think the big miscalculation was that you could push NATO expansion closer and closer to the Russian border and expect Russia not to react, like it almost did not react in the first 5 waves of NATO expansion. Now, NATO expansion, short of Russian military intervention, is a successful policy. But NATO expansion that leads to Russian military action is in an instant a determination of its failure. And that happened on the 24th of February, 2022. For Ukraine, I think this notion that you could, given the basic divisions within the country, that you could take very sharp foreign policy and security turns, despite deep divisions within the country, which were which were visible throughout its 30-year existence as an independent state since 1991, and which got exacerbated in 2014 after the Maidan events of 2014. And the long period of instability between 2014 and 2021, that you could shift the country dramatically in one direction and expect to continue to take the country forward as business as usual was a gross miscalculation. I think, tragically, that too has gone wrong. So there are three big miscalculations in play. And India has taken a very cautious view, largely on account of the fact that the prognosis is rather pessimistic, because there are three different levels of conflict that are taking place, four different levels of conflict. First, there's a military conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There's a larger conflict between Russia and the West, and there is an economic sanctions dimension. There is an information war dimension, and all these are sort of intermingling. And India has called for peace and dialogue and the settlement of the issue through negotiations. There was a brief window of for negotiations in the first couple of weeks of the conflict, but that window appears to have closed. Presently, it is almost now a contest of will through a contest of arms. No one is so strong as to finally prevail, and no one is as weak as to weak enough to concede. We are now, I think, reaching the end of the second phase. There's been a lull in the ground military operations after the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. But the prospects for an early conclusion of the conflict appear bleak. In fact, the prospects for a dramatic escalation of the conflict, unfortunately, appears to be on the cards. Russia has emerged after a long hibernation within the Soviet Union. It will continue to be preoccupied with the consequences of the ongoing collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the Soviet collapse was without a contest of arms. Everybody had presumed that it was a fortunate turn of events and good diplomacy, especially by the United States, where major conflicts were avoided when such a big country sort of broke up. Unfortunately, that call of optimism, I think, was a little too early in historical sense. Because now what we are seeing in Ukraine is reopening of the territorial settlement related to the breakup of the Soviet Union, but a territorial settlement that also goes back to the end of the Second World War. The settlements of the Yalta agreements. And Ukraine is not the only place where territorial adjustments were done at the end of the Second World War. There are settlements in Kaliningrad, and Kaliningrad will remain as a flashpoint, a very major flashpoint. It might become, as someone mentioned, like the new West Berlin in this new phase of confrontation between Russia and the West. The joining of Finland and Sweden into NATO again aggravates a historic problem that Russia had with regard to the Barents and the Baltic Seas. And those of you who have read history would know that Stalin tried just before the commencement of the Second World War for the Soviet Union, before the Germans invaded in June 1941. Earlier on, Stalin tried to get territorial concessions and advantages out of. Now, those territorial questions were kept dormant and without conflict for the last 70 years, largely on account of the fact that Finland and Sweden kept away from the confrontation, the bipolar confrontation between Russia and NATO. But now that they've joined NATO, that will also go into the mix. So you have the Barents Sea, the Baltic Sea, you already have the Black Sea, and I would definitely say that Russia's approach to Ukraine and its territorial ambitions in southern Ukraine are also directly related to its perception of security in the Black Sea area. And the Black Sea area, there are a number of new players. You have the whole Trans-Caucasus again sort of coming into play. You have the new, very energetic actor in terms of Turkey, who is a member of NATO, has supported Ukraine, has claims of a historical nature with Crimea, has very good relations with Azerbaijan, and is wanting to create a niche for itself in the larger conflict in the Middle East. You may have heard today that it was announced that Russia, Turkey, and Iran will have a summit in Tehran in the next coming days. So there are a lot of permutations and combinations that are taking place. Now, the other peripheral problems of Russia, which are a handover holdout of the breakup of the Soviet Union, of course, are the Central Asian states. And the Central Asian states have varying degrees of stability, dependence on Russia, and a newfound alignments with China. And of course, we have the problem instability emanating out of Afghanistan. So, a brief word about NATO. You see, NATO expansion in the manner that it is taking place, and especially after the new summit, after NATO having taken over new responsibilities, not just with respect to Finland and Sweden, but in terms of the nature of security threat it perceives from Russia, in a very real sense, emanating from the ongoing conflict with Ukraine. NATO is not like a Lego box where you just keep adding on, and the nature of the organization remains the same. NATO is now today poised to be very, very different from the NATO of the Cold War period. NATO of the Cold War period was an extremely successful alliance, in fact, as it's often called, one of the most successful military alliances in the world, because it had a very, very clear military objective, a very clear central front, and a very clear fronts in terms of its flanks. And in the Cold War period, NATO was essentially a defensive alliance with an uncontested but coordinated, uncontested nuclear umbrella of the United States and coordinated nuclear forces of France and the United Kingdom. And it was a very clear bipolar confrontation. And very quickly, it evolved into certain rules of the road and certain rules of the game. A very clear objective, very clear strategy, a very clear decision-making in NATO. Today's NATO is completely unrecognizable as compared to what we see in the Cold War period. Now we see flanks, not just one, 3 or 4 main flanks, central fronts that are appearing. Ukraine, of course, Poland, of course, is a very obvious one. Lithuania, Kaliningrad is sort of bubbling on the surface. You have the whole Baltic and the Barents Sea opening up. You have the Black Sea area opening up. And if you go into further deep into the Trans-Caucasus area, NATO's front today or in the future will be much longer than the front that NATO fought on during the Cold War period. And NATO's military force today is almost half of the forces that it deployed in the Cold War period. Now, this notion that the NATO will deploy in quick measure 300,000 troops in terms of mobile units is very different from the permanent but concentrated deployment of American forces in Europe. So what I'm trying to say is that when people say it's a new Cold War coming up, and it tends to give us the impression that it is a repetition of what happened in the past. I would suggest that it is a new confrontation, but very different in character and very different in its implications. Of course, if this is the confrontation that is now taking place with Russia, we can expect Russia to embark on a very major military buildup. Russia has had a military buildup for the last 12 to 15 years, firstly in terms of military modernization, military buildup in terms of armaments. It has its pluses and minuses, and if those are interested, I can give you my impression during the discussion period. But clearly that will not be sufficient. A Russian military budget is what, $75 billion a year. I mean, if you want to increase it, say another 20%, say $100 billion a year. United States and NATO military budget is $1 trillion a year. It's 1/10. And both the United States and NATO budgets are poised for major expansion by themselves. So that will of course, have a big knock-on effect on the security and stability of the whole Eurasian continent. The expectation is that the United States will remain committed because its commitments have increased dramatically in Europe. Its intention to move to what is called the Indo-Pacific will be constrained in terms of not by policy, there is a policy commitment on part of the United States, but more by material constraints and an attention span, and the fact that many of NATO allies do want a further deepening of American commitment in Europe rather than elsewhere in the world, particularly the Baltic countries, Poland, and others. So it will have huge geopolitical ramifications. We are now entering into an era of big power confrontation that has been rarely seen in history. And I don't want to over-dramatize this, but clearly, and I witnessed it myself in Moscow, the steady breakdown in dialogue, in communication, now in contacts, in terms of people-to-people contacts, not just at the official level, in terms of diplomats, in terms of embassies. Now, more than 1,000 big American companies have pulled out of Russia. It's not just the sanctions, it's not just the cutting off of SWIFT, they're not just not allowing airlines to come and go. You see, I witnessed the birth of a modern, very vibrant Russian middle class. And I could relate to that because my country, India, opened up to the outside world. We were always open to the outside world, but we dismantled our planned economy, our socialist economy in 1991, 92, and we opened up to the world. And that led to a certain amount of engagement with globalization, and that led to the birth of a middle class in India. And that middle class is very much alive, is doing well. We engage broadly with with everyone in the world. There was a similar but much smaller scale middle class that grew up in Russia. Modern, educated, outgoing, had their holidays abroad, happy to have closed the door on the Soviet past. And the huge amount of sanctions will have, unfortunately, this impact on what is one of the great growth stories in Russia, which is the growth of the middle class, as we broadly call it, not just in an economic sense, but in a more comprehensive, in a more social sense. Now, that middle class will get atrophied as we go along. There will also be a decline, there has been a sharp decline in contacts with Russia, which is on both sides. Sometimes Russians are backed off, sometimes the Europeans are backed off, sometimes the United States is backed off, which I think is, it's a great tragedy, because whatever the conflict situation that arises between countries, I think keeping contacts open at the people, scholars, universities, cultural level, I think should continue. We've kept up our contacts. India still continues to maintain its relations with Russia. We are cognizant of the fact that relations with Russia have to be taken forward, taking into account the impact that it might have on our relations with the European Union and with the United States, which are at where we enjoy very, very good relations with both Europe and the United States. Now, this is a diplomatic challenge that we have to face up to, and I think we're doing it rather well as we go along. Let me say a word before I end on about the importance of Russia studies, the broad field in which all of you come from. And I mentioned this earlier in my talk. Every diplomat has also to be a little bit of a scholar, because you need to read, you need to understand ideas, you need to understand histories. So I've greatly benefited from European and American scholarship on Russia, in my working life. And sadly enough, that seems to have taken a turn for not for the better. The new, unfortunately, after the end of the Cold War, there had been a decline in the importance of Russian studies, and so the older generation of Russian scholars, absolutely brilliant, world-class scholars, not just in the Russian field, but also in my other field of interest, the disarmament and non-proliferation. They all have passed away. And those who have taken their place, unfortunately, do not measure up to the rigors of scholarship that was shown, in the past. And there's much too much of generalizations, there's much too much of disdain, and an increasing disconnection with ground realities. And scholarship and policy cannot pursue when I often think George Kennan wrote that piece in the summer of 1947. And if we were to expect one of the most senior Russian scholars to write today, how different would it be? Kennan wrote about the sources of Soviet contact. He mentioned Stalin, who was the reigning leader of the Soviet Union, undisputed for several decades, largely unseen in Moscow in his time, between 46 and 47, having already suffered a stroke. cloaked in mystery, and he barely mentioned Stalin once or twice. And he very clearly said, this is about Stalin, but it goes beyond Stalin. The sources of Soviet conflict is not personal idiosyncrasies. And that is why we read Kennan 60, 70 years later. So this notion that what is going on wrong in Russia is all related to, one person or a small clique or some organization that they come from. I mean, personally, I find it quite, quite a mark of a sharp fall in scholarship, I would say. So I'll end with that, and I end on a more positive hope that all of you, being the young generation of scholars, will take forward the Russia studies on your shoulders with great dedication and with great professionalism. And I wish you all success in that. And I'll be happy to answer questions or comments that you might have. Thank you.